there's a situation of money, you can talk to me. If it's a situation, you should not be participating in either. Josh does it. So, here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, the last item I talked about is the Treaty of Ghent. The last item we talked about is the Treaty of Ghent. Ladies and gentlemen, the Treaty of Ghent is the agreement to conclude the war. When you look at the War of 1812, the one thing I would add, there are some you're going to need to know, but they're not. At Fort McHenry, Star Spangled Banner. Okay? Would be the item. Plattsburgh is the battle that basically convinced the British that, you know what, they really did not want to go through this. They'd been at war for a long time with Napoleon. Let's cut our losses and go home. Ladies and gentlemen, with the Treaty of Ghent, Quanta Bellum. War. I know that may not sound exciting. I know it, in all honesty, in my brain, I think back to elementary school when something would happen where kickball at recess and we didn't know what to do. You know, it hit the ball, hit the monkey bars. Kid comes walking in and, you know, it hit him. And what did us ingenious second graders come up with? Do-over. I mean, isn't that, the war didn't happen. And I believe somebody mentioned yesterday, well, we go back to the beginning of the war, but a lot of the original problems are gone. Tecumseh's dead, Indian problem gone. We learned that Canada hates us. Stupid Canadians. Search, season, impressment will disappear because the French war is over. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we want to understand, and even in terms of war hawks, America at least felt we got respect because England didn't beat us. Please understand, if you are looking for more concrete, tangible what happens, there are what are called post-war agreements that have more definitive significance. It does this, it does this. The Treaty of Ghent is the agreement that actually ends the war. The next item we'd like to talk about is the Hartford Convention. I mentioned this when the war started. Who wasn't happy? The Federalists were not happy. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we want to look at is the Hartford Convention is kind of really the prime example, the tip of the iceberg. And if you really pay attention here, there's some high-end valuable crap. I'm not kidding. And ladies and gentlemen, high-end valuable crap doesn't mean the Hartford Convention is the single biggest item. Clearly, Marbury, Madison, Louisiana Purchase, they trump the others. In the Hartford Convention, it gives you some bigger items in terms of what is happening between North and South. Why do they disagree? What is the problem? In the Hartford Convention, a group of the Federalist New England states gather together to discuss the war, the future, the United States of America. And why don't I give you the big item first? When the Federalist states gather together, the first topic, the first item was secession. And who can define what does that mean? Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time in our class, a group of states are so angry, so disappointed, that they discuss would the only alternative be to leave. And of course, what is weird? In 1814, secession is being discussed by
North.
The North. And of course, the reason I find it weird is in 1860-61, secession will be implemented by the
South.
Folks, what do you want to notice on a bigger issue for the future? Bigger topic. That really shows that there is a problem between North and South. That is sectionalism. That is the regional bickering. There is something between North and South that was not working. So, ladies and gentlemen, the first idea is secession, and what do we need to say is New England rejects it. It was brought up, they discuss it, but it is rejected. However, yes, sir, I'm sorry.
Wasn't the Byrd conspiracy kind of like secession?
There is no doubt that if you would have actually gotten his full plan, the reason most people do not go into that is it was a small group that really did not get to the point of a formal discussion. This was a meeting where they are openly proposing it, but you are correct. If you were being very clever, you could bring that in as an example. I do agree with you.
Yeah, so how is this like treason or something? Are you allowed, like, Can Wisconsin say we want to be our own country without like?
I think this is the freedom of speech and freedom of press. It's kind of like, remember when Jefferson and Madison came up with nullification as an argument? To discuss and debate is an American right. To take action, that's a different situation.
Okay.
So ladies and gentlemen, the next part is the part I told you to be careful of. Be wary of. The Federalists do propose 5 amendments. Ladies and gentlemen, are any of them going to pass? What do you need to get an amendment? Not all, not all, not all.
3/4.
Not majority. What?
3/4.
75%. Folks, here, slow down. What is it I want you to think about? The Federalists are angry. They feel nobody likes them. They are going to propose 5 amendments. If the Federalists could get what they wanted, would they be angry and upset? Who is it that is blocking all the crap they want? The southern states have more votes where?
In the South.
Not in the South. Where do we vote?
The House.
The Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, what you want to understand throughout our class, I realize when you sit here in high school in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, do not ever underestimate the power of the Congress. The Congress determines how each and every one of us live. They determine if we go to war. Do not underestimate it.
Congress building the power of action.
But it's still a group of people who make the laws. They just relocate it to different places. Very clever. Here we go. There are 5. Number 1. So ladies and gentlemen, folks, what is the big item here? Am I telling you that this is what... I think if you know these, you're going to get an understanding of why the North and the South are fighting. These are arguments to the North of what is wrong in the country. The North is arguing if we would do this... Folks, this is what is constantly happening. Our country is out of balance. Right now, the balance favored the South. The North complains. In 1861, guess what? Our country's out of balance, but the balance favored who?
No.
The North. That is kind of the problem. What was happening is if you were not the group who got what you wanted, people were beginning to get mad. Number 1. And you know what? Some of you might agree with number 1. I'm not saying these are bad proposals. The problem is, the only way you can get something passed is you need a 3/4 vote. And there were other states that were going to, no way, no way. Number 1, repeal the 3/5 compromise. Which states are not going to do that? Well, states with slavery, right? Because it weakens them where?
Economically.
Not economically, because the 3/5 compromise doesn't say we can't have slavery, right? It weakens their power in the House, right? Because 3/5 of the slave population counts representation. 2. If you don't get this one, get your hand up. Require a 2/3 vote to declare war. Require a 2/3 vote to declare war. Anyone? Who can explain to me what is their argument here? Why are they whining here? Yes.
They went into war with England, but they didn't want to.
The Federalist state voted no, and what did the country still do? We went to war. So what the Federalists are arguing is basically, what is their real argument? You should have to get it. So how would you do that? You raise the voting requirement, correct?
What is it right now?
Majority. It's like any other law. 3. Limit, prohibit, restrict Congress's ability to pass an embargo. Remember this, I've talked to some people. This is that argument of whether an embargo was a loose interpretation. Remember, the argument was Congress could regulate commerce. Does an embargo go beyond what Congress should be allowed to do? It is very much like, is a protective tariff different than a revenue tariff? Why is the Federalist complaining? Because the Democratic Republicans could control Congress, and they were able to get what they wanted.
What is embargo?
An embargo is an ending, a stopping of trade, like the embargo of 1807. Number 4. Do you know what? Maybe you like this one. Maybe you think it's a good idea. The president could have only 1 term. Ladies and gentlemen, what has become the basic pattern of America at this time in history?
2.
Presidents get 2. That's 8 years. That's a long time if you're not
In power.
majority, if you're not happy, if your group's not in power. And let's be honest, the only presidents who have gotten 1 term will be Adam's father and son. And if you put them together, they get 2 terms. But if you follow the list, Washington, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Jefferson, Madison, Madison, Monroe, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Jackson. Everybody else gets 2, unless your name is Adam. After Jackson begins to screw up a little bit. So once we get to Jackson, we are going to run into some round. We have some presidents who die. We have some presidents who are incompetent. It's going to get screwed up. You have a long way to go to get to FDR. We got Quentin up there, and see, he's thinking about Hitler too. Number 5. Ladies and gentlemen, immediately, as soon as you know what the term is to describe this, please put your hand up and answer the question. So what I'm asking for is not what this means. What would this be an example of? Does everybody understand that? Number 5, it should be illegal for naturalized citizens to hold public office. It should be illegal, yes sir. Ladies and gentlemen, what you want to understand is this is an example of nativism. America is beginning to experience a period of immigration. The Irish and the Germans. We'll talk more about that later. The problem is the Irish and the German are a little bit different than the Old Federalists. Remember, New England was primarily what group of people? Who were the original New England people? But what were they? What brought them to New England?
Puritan.
What was New England's foundation?
Religion.
What religion? Puritan. Folks, the Irish are what? Very much what?
Catholic.
They're Catholic. Who did that not go well? So please understand, what they're saying is, New England doesn't want to tell the immigrants not to come because they need them where? What is developing in New England? Factories. We want them to work in our factories. But what don't we want them to do? We don't want them to vote. We don't want them to run for office. We don't want them to have any power. So come, get a crappy job, and shut up. That's what we want. So in many ways, if you live in the North, an immigrant is a nicer version of what? A slave. Make no mistake. In fact, there are studies, and today they're not very popular, but there were studies right around the turn of the century which were designed to show kind of the life expectancy, the, kind of the food and stuff. And what many researchers argued, if you looked at the living conditions of a slave versus that of an immigrant, the argument was, and clearly I'm not trying to support this, that an immigrant actually had worse conditions than a slave. Clearly, what is the one factor that you cannot compare the two? But one's property. The one person doesn't have a choice, right? If you're a slave, can you all of a sudden go, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore? That's not an option. You can go west, right? Or you stay. Once again, I want to be clear because there's always somebody in the room who didn't listen. Which one of these amendments passed? None. None of them. What is the point? Why would I spend time? Because it begins to give you ideas of what the North and the South are disagreeing about. Literally, the Federalists are to the point we need amendments about these things. The Federalists were so mad they actually proposed secession.
It just came up in my mind after DC was burned. Where was the locked, right?
Philadelphia. It's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, there's one more item I'd like to have you put down here. It fits here as well as anywhere else. Does anyone know why the Hartford Convention ends and why they don't make any decisions and why they end up kind of just sort of putting their heads down and going home? Literally, what ends the Hartford Convention? And why do the Federalists kind of have egg all over their face?
They don't have enough power to make sense.
Clearly they don't have enough to implement them. But why do they give up their meeting? Why don't they keep fighting? Why don't they keep arguing? What was the number one issue that had the Federalists all riled up? The thing that they said was the problem, and what was going on in America they didn't like? Folks, when the war ends, the Hartford Convention, because most of their grievances, the embargo and that stuff kind of comes to conclusion, and the other thing you want to be aware of, is after the war, there was a very anti-federalist movement in America. In fact, the Federalist Party dissolves by 1816 because many Americans felt that they were too pro-England. Many people were almost getting to the point that they were referring to Federalists as Tories. So during the war, there was kind of this fine line. Are the Federalists supporting England, or are the Federalists almost getting to the point where they want to join England? Questions? Last item, and this is a famous item. Ladies and gentlemen, our last item is the Battle of New Orleans. I lied. Please, before we do that, otherwise it won't make any sense. Please change it, put the Creek War. Because if we don't do it in this order, it won't make any sense. It will work, just put the Creek War, the Creek Battle, whatever you want to say. We're dealing with the Creek Indians. Because if we don't do this, you're going to get confused where Andrew Jackson comes from, and chronologically this makes sense. The Creek War is actually in 1813. It's in the middle of the War of 1812. Ladies and gentlemen, Creeks were a very powerful, very warlike Indian tribe in the area of Georgia and Alabama. So ladies and gentlemen, first fact I would try to put in my head, Creeks are Indians in the Deep South, Georgia, Alabama area. What happens is very similar. I mean, Tecumseh tried desperately to get the Creeks to join the Red Sticks. The Creeks felt that they didn't need help. The Creeks felt that they were strong enough that they could take care of their problems by themselves. What happens is in the middle of the War of 1812, the Creek Indian chief named Red Eagle announces that the Creek Indians are joining the war. So in the War of 1812, the Creek Indians basically declare war on the United States, and basically they believe that they are joining the English. Next. As the Creek Indians declare war, what is really the most important thing you want to be aware of? Because we're in the middle of the War of 1812, because there's a lot going on in the country, the Creeks don't get a lot of attention. I mean, let's be honest. If the Creeks lead a few war paths, if they burn down some houses, and we're right at the time where the Capitol is burned, you're not going to get the front page of the newspaper, right? Folks, what happens is the Creek Indians begin to get angry that they don't get attention. They get angry that the government doesn't come to talk to them. And the Creek Indians then decide to organize a much larger event, and they are going to attack a place called Fort Mims. Ladies and gentlemen, if you were a Creek Indian, this would be an example of the power, the strength of the Creek Nation. Mims. Ladies and gentlemen, Fort Mims is one of our, we've talked about them before. It's a frontier fort. Historically what happens is when the Indians go on the warpath, bless you, that's where all the settlers go, and you simply hide inside. The Indian down the crops, the Indians burn down your home, and you're safe in the fort. Normally the Indians, because they have small raiding parties, they avoid the forts. Folks, in this particular case, the Creek Indians decide to attack one of the forts. They basically surround it, they besiege it, and they burn it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of those examples that if you were in a college class, you can go into great detail. The great detail is the difference of opinion. The Creek Nation, look at the Creek as an example of their power. It's a great military victory. It was the Creek basically showing that they were no longer going to tolerate intrusion on their land. Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to emphasize is the Creeks would argue that the Battle of Fort Mims was a wonderful victory. That is not how it will be portrayed in American newspapers. Ladies and gentlemen, and this is when we throughout the class use the word propaganda, when we use the word kind of information, what people believe, sensationalism. American newspapers use titles like savage, barbaric, inhumane. Why? What American newspapers argue is the majority of the people in the fort were women and children. Because the way the system worked is the women and children would be put in the fort, and men would go out to try to tend of the farms, would try to, take care of the animals and maybe try to, fight off the Indians. So what the Americans argue is the Indians were so savage, so cruel, that they burned down, burning alive, over 400 women and children. Ladies and gentlemen, where is the truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. Clearly, they probably were not women and children. Could it have been largely? Yeah. Folks, what is the result of Fort Mims? America is angry. The Creeks get attention. And unfortunately for the Creeks, the decision is made to send an army. And ladies and gentlemen, for the first time in our class, we introduce Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is a lot like Hamilton or Jefferson. You either will like him or you will despise him. To this day, what is one of the reasons you do not see more public acknowledgement of Andrew Jackson? Native Americans hate him. They hate him. Because Andrew Jackson kind of becomes the epitome of war against the Indians. Was Andrew Jackson the only army that marched? No. But again, he becomes president, he is exceedingly popular, and he was fairly outspoken. He did not care for the natives. So here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Jackson. I'm sorry, sir.
He was so vulgar, his parrot was expelled from his funeral. Andrew Jackson was so vulgar, his pet parrot was expelled from his funeral.
Oh, because of what it said? We will find out Andrew Jackson is definitely, he's different. And folks, the different part of Andrew Jackson, we'll talk more about him when he becomes president, and here's the weird part. Andrew Jackson is half gentleman. He had a plantation. He was a relatively successful man. He had manners and etiquette. But he also lived on the frontier. He is the first president from one of the non-13. He was living in Tennessee. Ladies and gentlemen, he also was a soldier, and he spent a lot of his life in taverns. So you have this man who could be very, very professional, very mannered. He also could be a drunkard.
How many states do we have at this time?
What year? By 1814, we would have 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, I believe it's at 18. Because Ohio became in 1803, Louisiana was 1812. And again, Louisiana was partly, as we went to war, we wanted to make sure to protect New Orleans. But I do believe that the next ones will come. There's a wave like Indiana, Illinois, they come kind of right after the war. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, the battle, and that's kind of what we're getting to, is called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The battle is in March of 1814. Ladies and gentlemen, the Creek Indians, Red Eagle, were very effective. They were very good. And basically what happens is the Creek Indians, over 1,000 of them, about 1,200 Creek Indians, are going to be dug in along a kind of a river embankment. For those of you who have not spent a lot of time outside, like in the woods, forest hunting, a embankment is a place where you have a river that basically overflows every year. So you basically, when the rainy season comes, there's this large, kind of looks like a dirt trench. Basically, the Indians are hiding behind this naturally built earth wall. As Jackson's men approach, the Indians are basically kind of like today, what would be behind a trench. When most people see the battlefield where the Indians are, most of Jackson's advisors are begging him to retreat. Because the Indians are very good fighters, they're very good shots, and they're hiding behind this solid earth wall. Andrew Jackson basically, and please understand, Jackson will be a very, very good military commander. Going to what Griffin asked yesterday, remember commanding general, field general? Andrew Jackson fights with the men. Andrew Jackson is not in a tent. Andrew Jackson is not making up plans. Andrew Jackson is on the front line. And make no mistake, if any of his men all of a sudden decided they were going to turn and run, I guarantee you, the first person that was going to be in your face was Old Hickory. He is tough. high-end. In fact, that is kind of the argument with Jackson. Did people love him and respect him, or were they scared of God of him? He is a frightening dude. Here's what happens. Jackson lines up his men, so basically it looks like a standing line battle. So his artillery column is lined up for the Indians. The battle begins, and Jackson primarily uses artillery. As the battle goes, Jackson then sends a group of his men, and they basically come down the river bend in order to flank the Indians. Folks, what's the big item? Is Jackson's army is lined up kind of across the open land. His army begins to start coming down River Bend. The Indians have nowhere to go. Either they have to run into the cannons, or they have to go right into Jackson's advancing column. The Indians are trapped. The only way that they could go is backwards, and they would have to cross the river. Ladies and gentlemen, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend is an absolute total slaughter. 700 natives are killed versus 26 of Jackson's men. Please understand, this is where Jackson gets the reputation of being a great general. Jackson was probably in the same neighborhood, 1500 or so. Folks, the battle here is an overwhelming, clear-cut, decisive victory, and there's one more thing you want to notice. What happened here and what the Creeks did wrong, the strategy that failed, Jackson will modify in the next battle. So please understand, this is where people say Jackson does have military tactician in him, military tactics. Jackson was able to see a battlefield, and he was able to identify weakness, strength, not simply they're good soldiers. Why are they in trouble? Ladies and gentlemen, why do so many Indians die? Part of it is, as the Indians basically were defeated, as the Indians began to try to swim and retreat, Jackson simply kept attacking. Jackson really was not going to show any remorse. What is the last item after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend? The Creek Indians were forced to surrender 20 million acres of land. So basically, most of Alabama and Georgia will be surrendered. So if you've been wondering why, for example, Alabama is not a state, it was largely conflict with natives. That is quickly going to end because the Indians have been driven out.
20 million?
20 million. And again, it's acres. So. And with that, now, ladies and gentlemen, where we can go is the treaty, or the Battle of New Orleans. The reason we need to do the one first is chronologically, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend is first. So I am going in chronological order. The other item is, you are going to notice that it is because of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. After Andrew Jackson decisively, overwhelmingly destroyed, and I mean destroyed, the Creek Indians, his reward was he was sent to New Orleans. So please understand, because of the overwhelming victory, Andrew Jackson is sent to New Orleans to guard the city. The attack on New Orleans will be led by a man named Edward Pakenham. The British Army actually comes up out of the West Indies. They technically come from Jamaica. The British Army will have about 11,000 men, and they will have close to 60 ships. Please understand, they're all very, many of them are just transport ships.
How many men do they have?
About 11,000. Please remember, some of them have to occupy the ships, though, so they are not going to fight with that many. The original invasion force is much smaller than that. The next thing you might want to be aware of, and I'm going to have to do two things, because I don't think I told you that, is the British Army is dropped off on December 23rd. That would be 1814. And ladies and gentlemen, because I'm guaranteeing I didn't do this, and I apologize, and it's a nice, easy date to remember, the Treaty of Ghent is signed on December 24th. So please notice that the British Army arrives in New Orleans one day after the Battle of New Orleans kind of begins. And notice I use the word kind of. Let me clarify. The war is over on December 24th. On December 23rd is when the British arrive in the area of New Orleans. Originally, the British arrived down here. folks, what you want to understand is the British Army, the Navy is coming this way. So the Navy is going to try to cut off the harbor. The British Army was literally dropped off south of the city, and they are beginning to advance. What happens is the news gets to New Orleans, and basically Andrew Jackson has a couple of days. And the problem is, because New Orleans is French and Spanish, there was not much of an army there. Despite the value, the importance of the city was very, very vulnerable. As the British Army is reported, Andrew Jackson is basically encouraged to try to protect the city. Everybody is telling Andrew Jackson, we must set up defenses, we must build up the city, we must prepare to, repel the British invasion. And Andrew Jackson, and again, please notice, Jackson is very different. He is going to go against traditional. What is the tradition? If you have a smaller army, you defend. You're dead. Andrew Jackson immediately forms an army, and his army was about 2,000 men. He forms his army, and immediately he marches out. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Jackson is heading out to fight. He is going to go out. He is going to take the army or the war to the enemy. British army will be at least 4,000 or 5,000. Okay? So clearly he is outnumbered. Most people would say this is stupid. What happens next, I honestly cannot tell you if this was the plan or if this was the luck. Andrew Jackson arrives at 7:30 at night. That was literally how the time it took him to get there. So they heard about the British arriving, he forms his army, they march out, and at 7:30, he arrives. He finds the British. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the part that, of course, becomes important, successful, this is what worked. Jackson immediately attacks. He attacks. Clearly, the British are surprised. They were not expecting the Americans to be so aggressive. They were not expecting the Americans to engage. And ladies and gentlemen, it's kind of like, remember we talked about even the Indian Wars, Fallen Timbers, Tippecanoe. The Indians attacked, the Americans got pushed back, but then the Americans counterattacked. What happens here? The Americans attack, and as the bigger British army begins to regroup, what happened?
Dark out.
It's too dark. Folks, the single most important thing about the original attack on December 23rd is Jackson hits his enemy. He knocks them back, and before they can punch back, the sun's gone. And ladies and gentlemen, here's the part you need to put in your brain. Andrew Jackson hits his enemy, Jackson then retreats. Jackson heads back. This is what, and again, folks, this is where you have to understand your enemy. Jackson had studied military tactics. Jackson had studied how the British did things in the Revolution. And what had Jackson guessed? If the British do not understand the situation, if the British are caught off guard, they will regroup, they will resupply, and they will reform their army. Ladies and gentlemen, the number one thing that we just did is Andrew Jackson buys time. Instead of having 2 days, Andrew Jackson now has 2 weeks to build up an army and defend New Orleans. The British army is so shocked, they are so surprised, that they do not follow Jackson. They stop the army, they lick their wounds, they contact the Navy, and the British are sitting there going, what the heck just happened? Why would they do that? Are we being circled? The British go into all of this kind of cautionary thought. That is what Jackson did. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, let's look at the real battle. The real battle is the Battle of New Orleans. So the first one is the skirmish. Why is the skirmish important? The skirmish is what gives Jackson time. The real battle is on January 8th. Notice the Treaty of Ghent is signed. January 8th, 1815. The war should be over. ladies and gentlemen, what we are going to diagram, what we're going to draw is in this one, I'm going to kind of show you the Battle of New Orleans. This is one I'm at least going to give you enough that you have an understanding of how this battle takes place.
I have to go to the send-off for the visitors.
I have to go or they shoot us. Go. Now, Victoria, I'm absolutely teasing.
I gotta go. Me too.
Cheer
Oh,
So, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at this, what I want you to know is how on earth Andrew Jackson is going to be able to beat a well-seasoned professional army that is significantly larger than him. First off, let's look at the battlefield. Andrew Jackson is going to pick a spot. That is the Mississippi River. No army is going to walk through that, right? So you have the river. Over here, you have hardcore swampland and the Gulf of Mexico. Not going to go through that. This was farm field. Okay? British are down here. This is Jackson. See the line? The line was a drainage ditch. The drainage ditch was about 4 feet wide. It was over 4 feet deep. The purpose of that, most of you know, the Mississippi River overflows. These ditches had been dug to help drain water off to protect the farm fields. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Jackson is going to put his men behind that. That drainage ditch will become the equivalent of a trench. It'll become like a moat. It'll be an obstacle for the British to get through. See that line? It was a stone wall. It was a farmer fence to divide two fields. It is behind that Jackson lines up his men. Next, when Jackson contacts back to New Orleans, the number one thing New Orleans has is cotton. Cotton, 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 cotton. Clearly, cotton does not seem like your normal military item. Just like we do today, Andrew Jackson ordered hundreds of bales of cotton to be brought up to the battlefield, and they were used as we use sandbags today. The cotton bales were stacked up to complete the rock wall. They were stacked up behind the battlefield. Literally, they stacked up cotton bales kind of like up in the air. So now you have one group of Americans on the ground. You have another group of Americans that were literally standing on cotton bales. So that way when the British come, the Americans are going to be fighting in two waves of men. Everybody okay? Next. Please notice the X's. Andrew Jackson developed a military philosophy where all throughout the battlefield his men are going to be lined up in groups of three. Jackson realizes the number one way that will determine if he wins is he has to prevent the British from getting to his line. How do you do that? We have to fire faster than they can run. The three X's means one man shoots. As soon as you shoot, you step, move back. The next man moves up, he shoots, and the last man is firing. So you have shooting, ready, loading. Shooting, ready, loading. Shooting, ready, loading. Constant. Remember how I said he only had 2,000 men? It grows to 4,500. Andrew Jackson recruited largely men out of the frontier. He was from Tennessee. He recruited men like Daniel Boone. Ladies and gentlemen, as we saw with Daniel Morgan, the men Jackson bring almost exclusively have rifles. In the Battle of New Orleans, we see, what if a large army, 4,500 men, are equipped with rifles going up with still a traditional musket-bearing army? See the little dots? Andrew Jackson also ordered target practice. Throughout the battlefield, remember that's a farm fence, they put like buckets, they put up scarecrows, and on several occasions Jackson ordered his men into columns and they literally had target practice. So as the British knew, they knew exactly how to calculate distance. Two more. The next one I think today with the way modern world is this one actually has a reference. Ladies and gentlemen, some of you might remember this from last year. Andrew Jackson also is going to allow, remember his men are from the frontier. Frontier men often fight who? The way you fight the Indians is very different. I mean, the Indians don't fight very politely. Andrew Jackson's men developed a game, and I want to be very clear, this was a game. It's called going hunting. As the Americans are sitting, remember, this is a 2-week gap, right? So the Americans build up their walls, and then they're kind of waiting around. And what they did is the men wanted to prove who is the strongest, who is the best soldier, so they developed a game. Folks, this was actually taken from the natives. The game was, you take your rifle, you set it down. In the middle of the night, you sneak out of camp. Okay? You cross a fence, you cross the open field, and you go walking.